Hello and welcome back to our conference on religion and the American founding. Want to again say thank you to our sponsors and our partners, the National Endowment for the Humanities, BYU's History and Political Science Department, the Wheatley Institute at BYU, and the America 250 program for the state of Utah. We also have sponsors and partnerships with the American Academy of Religion, the ATLA database, BYU's Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship, Utah County, the Clements Family Foundation, and Larry H. and Gail Miller. We had a wonderful morning learning about the American Revolution, learning about the early United States and the role of religion. My name is Joey Stewart. I teach here at BYU, and I have the honor of introducing our speakers today. We're going to have a slight deviation from our program. Lisa Minardi is not able to be with us, so we'll be watching her on video. So she gets the benefit of getting to share but not have to look any of us in the eye as she does so. We'll then get to learn from Priscilla Eppinger, followed by Taffy Hall and Ann McShane. We'll take it to that point. And thanks to all the tech folks.
This presentation about Lutheran artifacts of the founding era. So we're going to be talking a lot about objects that are featured in an upcoming exhibition called Window to Revolution, Pennsylvania Germans and the War for Independence. And this exhibit is being run by a sister institution of the Lutheran Archives Historic Tract, which conveniently I'm also director of. So I'll be able to share from both institutions' collections here. The exhibit opens on April 18th of 2026 in time for the America 250 celebrations, and then it continues through February 27th, 2028 to carry us through the winter of, or at least partly through, the winter of the Valley Forge encampment, which was in our area of Pennsylvania. Here's a brief introduction to Historic Tract, which is home to the Muhlenberg family, certainly of German Lutheran fame. This is where Lutheran immigrant Henry Muhlenberg came over from Germany, settled in 1742, built a parsonage where he founded the Lutheran Ministerium of Pennsylvania. That's not shown here on the screen, but it is another property that we do own and will be restoring in the future. What you see here from left to right is our Dewey's Tavern, which is the home to the Center for Pennsylvania German Studies, where this exhibition is going to be held. And then in the middle is the retirement home of Henry Muhlenberg, which we'll learn a little bit more about in just a few minutes. And then to the right is the home of his middle son, Frederick Muhlenberg, which is known as the Speaker's House due to his political career, which I will touch on. So let's just give some geographic context first of all. So the village of Trapp is located in what's now Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, originally part of Philadelphia County. We're located about 7 miles from Valley Forge, and we are right on the original colonial highway that ran from Philadelphia to Reading. So 2 prominent major towns, a port city and a big inland town, and we're just about halfway in between them. So while Trapp was a small village in the 18th century, it was a very common stopping point for wagons, for travelers, and for armies as they were marching around during the Revolutionary War, particularly 1777 and 78. Here's a look at the floor plan for the Center for Pennsylvania German Studies, and this is where the Window to Revolution exhibition will be held. As you can see, it's going to take over the entire first floor of the center. And so what I'm going to do now is kind of walk you through this exhibition with a focus on the Lutheran specific objects that we will be displaying. So the first gallery of the exhibit is an introduction to the idea of churches, meeting houses, and other religious institutions that were literally witnesses to war as the American Revolution unfolded all around them. And so we're particularly looking for objects like the pewter communion service that you see here from Augustus Lutheran Church in Trapp, which Henry Muhlenberg helped to found and oversaw its construction. And when that church is occupied during the war, these objects literally would have been witnesses to what was going on all around them. Here's a view of the exterior of the church as it looks today. The building is very original and intact to when it was first built, so it's a National Historic Landmark, which we're quite proud of. And up on the roof of the church today are replicas made by the blacksmiths at Colonial Williamsburg of the original weather vanes, which you see here on the left. They're made of wrought iron, probably by a local blacksmith named Friedrich Marsteller, who was one of the founding Lutherans of Augustus Church. But they're not signed, so we can't say for sure, just that he was the town's blacksmith at the time. But they're incredible objects. They were literally up on the church roof from 1743 all the way until I think it was 2011 when the latest cedar roof was put on that structure and the decision was made to retire them and replace them with replicas. But the good thing about that is that now these have been conserved and they are on display at Historic Trap, and just incredible examples of local craftsmanship, also Germanic influences there with the tulip decoration in particular. But these weather vanes were up on the roof literally and witnessed the Continental Army encamped here in Trap in the fall of 1777. Augustus Lutheran Church was also used as a field hospital. So in between the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, all sorts of Quaker meeting houses, churches of all denominations were taken over as sort of triage hospitals by the Continental Army. And so Augustus was one of them, much to Henry Muhlenberg's dismay. But it wasn't just churches. So bigger religious institutions, places like the Ephrata Cloister that you see here, also Moravian dormitories and housing, they were used for larger groups of people as more longer-term convalescing hospitals. And so that's also something that we'll talk about in this gallery. The next gallery focuses on Peter Muhlenberg, Henry's oldest son, and his transition from Lutheran pastor to Revolutionary War general, and looking at the war in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And so we'll have objects in that gallery, such as this great painted hanging cupboard made by local craftspeople in the Shenandoah Valley, and then a portrait of General Muhlenberg painted by John Trumbull, looking very much like George Washington, but that's because it was Trumbull. Here's earlier portraits of Peter in his actual wartime uniform based on the style of it, as well as his father, Henry Muhlenberg. And there's a lot of dialogue, or sort of one-way dialogue, let's say, recorded in Henry's journals, giving his thoughts about Peter's enlistment in the Continental Army, which his father was definitely not happy about, that his son had given up the pulpit and enlisted in the army. You may be familiar with the legend of Peter as the fighting parson of the Revolution. This is the clerical robe from the 18th century that he supposedly wore when he mounted the pulpit in January of 1776 to deliver his farewell sermon. And according to that legend, he had his army uniform on underneath. Gave the sermon based on Ecclesiastes, there's a time to pray and a time to fight, and then, whips open this robe to reveal his uniform, and then promptly, enlists a bunch of the congregation, and off they go to war. It's a very famous legend. It's something that we're definitely exploring. What I can say at this point is that there aren't any contemporary accounts of it from all of those eyewitnesses in the congregation. So I'll leave you with that. But the robe does survive, and here you see the original in its conservation box. And we have a grant from the Society of the Cincinnati in Pennsylvania to fund a replica of it, which is being made by the gentleman there on the right, Neil Hurst from Colonial Williamsburg. So we have that project going on, and the replica will be mounted on a mannequin then in the exhibition. We also will be displaying a replica of the original flag, which you see here, of that 8th Virginia Regiment, which descended in Peter Muhlenberg's family. And then we're also borrowing from the Museum of the American Revolution the actual pistols, the brass barrel pistols that Peter carried with him at the Battle of Germantown. Our third gallery is going to take a look at soldiers, both Hessian soldiers and Continental Army soldiers, who then after the war became schoolmasters and in some cases Fraktur artists, the Pennsylvania German manuscript art known as Fraktur. And so one of those who we know for sure was Lutheran is a man named Conrad Gilbert. He settled in what's now Montgomery County. He knew Henry Muhlenberg. They interacted quite a bit. And this is a birth and baptismal certificate that Conrad made for his nephew, Matthias Gilbert, in 1782, But the amazing thing is we can match the handwriting on this. Most of the handwriting there in the blue ink is actually Henry Muhlenberg's handwriting. So it's a really incredible piece of Lutheran history as well as local folk art. Another artist we're researching is Christian Strenge. He was a Hessian soldier who stayed here in Pennsylvania and became a schoolmaster. And so here's just one example of many of his pieces. Another artist that I'd love to prove whether or not he's Lutheran. I'm still working on it, but his nickname is the Cecil Washington artist. There's a long story behind that, but he makes both direct, iconography like this portrait of Washington on horseback, but he also makes a lot of the birth and baptismal certificates coming out of the Lutheran and Reformed traditions. The fourth gallery is actually going to take a look back 100 years to 1926 when Philadelphia hosted the Sesquicentennial Exposition. And there was a display of Pennsylvania German folk art at that. And this is, peak like colonial revival era. This is when museums like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Met are founding their American wings and putting period rooms in them. And so folk art was very much part of that conversation at the time. And this chest made for Peter Brown of Central Pennsylvania in 1834 was one of those pieces in the exhibit. After the exhibit closed, this antiques dealer, A.H. Rice from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, sought to cash in, if you will, on the notoriety of this furniture. And so he took out this double-page spread advertising these objects for sale in the magazine Antiques in December of 1926. And so we've been able to locate the two pieces actually there in the ad. And we're very excited that the Peter Brown chest will be part of our exhibition. And the Brown family and also the Mazer family of the desk that you just saw, they were both belonged to the Himmels Church, which was a union congregation. So a Lutheran and a Reformed congregations who shared one building and worshiped there. So many of them went to that church. Some of them also went to the nearby Salem Reformed Church, now UCC. But here's just a look at the gravestones of what would be the father and the brother of Peter Brown, whose chest will be in the exhibition. And then the fifth gallery, this is really the biggest focus gallery for the show, the Window to Revolution one. And so we're very excited that with our partnership between the Lutheran Archive Center and Historic Trapp, that Henry Muhlenberg's journals will be returning to Trapp for the first time since they were written, as far as we can document. And so here you see his entry for July 4th of 1776, where he is sharing the news, that today the Continental Congress has announced that North America is going to be, free and independent states. And you can hopefully see the words America and Congress and independent that he's kind of written in English text versus the rest of the German script. And he goes on to say that, who knows how this is going to turn out. Muhlenberg was there in Philadelphia on July 8th. He heard the declaration read out loud in English publicly. He possibly could have seen one of these German translations of the Declaration, which were rushed into print sometime between July 6th and July 8th by the German printers Melchior Steiner and Karl Kist. There's only 2 copies of this known to survive, one in Berlin, one in Gettysburg, and so we will be showing a facsimile of this in the exhibit. But we are borrowing one of the only original copies of the German translation of Common Sense, the famous work by Thomas Paine. The original English version was printed in January 1776. By March, it had been translated into German, and we know that Henry Muhlenberg read it because in his journals on March 7th, 1776, this is a direct quote from the journals. He says, "The young people are right in fighting for their God-given native liberty." And this is one of the only times in his journals where Muhlenberg sort of gives you a little bit of insight into his opinion on what was going on with the war. He's normally very guarded, doesn't go into his opinions. He was always concerned that his journals might fall into the wrong hands and get him into trouble for what he might have said. And also as a pastor, he felt that he needed to remain neutral. We're also, in addition to the Muhlenberg journals and other documents, we're going to be exhibiting a lot of artifacts here. And so here is this incredible pewter flagon from St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Allentown, made in Philadelphia by craftsman William Will, a German immigrant. He was a Reformed Church member, but William Will is sort of known as like the Paul Revere of pewter making. He was a craftsman, he was a patriot, he was a soldier, and later Sheriff of Philadelphia. Another example by William Will, this mug inscribed liberty or death, huzzah for Captain Ickes. And Ickes was a Lutheran born in the Trapp area and then moved out to York County, Pennsylvania. One last object I'll share here is this great 1776 Bible printed in Germantown. And as we page through it, it was nicknamed the Gunwad Bible because some of the paper got seized by the army and used actually as gun wadding, like to wrap musket balls in. But this one has incredible artwork done by a Lutheran, Johann Adam Eyer, this family record, which he made for a Mennonite couple, Christian Meyer and Maria Landis, around 1784. So together, all of these objects are going to tell a more complete story of the American Revolution and really show the central role that was played by German Lutherans in our nation's founding. These themes are then going to be brought to life a bit further at both the Muhlenberg House and the Speaker's House. And so I will very quickly just give you those examples. So the Muhlenbergs moved back to Trapp July 11th, 1776, and their house becomes a refuge for family members, up to 32 people. So here's Henry's office. This is literally his window to the Revolution where he sees armies marching by. This is where he continues writing in those amazing journals telling us what's going on. But the house is complete chaos during the war. So, visitors to the house are going to see, beds turned up, trunks being packed, just this frenzy of family moving to and fro between Philadelphia and the countryside. The normally tranquil, beautiful dining room of the house, we are transforming into soldiers, literally sleeping on the bare floor of the dining room, which we know, thanks to Muhlenberg's journals, really did happen. And the Continental Army also takes over the basement of the house. And so we're staging some of that as well in the building. Over at the Speaker's House, Henry's son Frederick's home, we're finishing up a 25-year restoration effort. Here's just a peek of the house covered in scaffolding. This is what it looked like when we began 25 years ago when we rescued it from demolition. So we've come a long way. Frederick, of course, was a Lutheran pastor, first like his father. You can see here his long political career rising through the ranks all the way to being the first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. So to learn more about Lutherans and the founding era, please come see this Window to Revolution exhibition opening April 18th. The Speaker's House grand opening will be April 11th. There will be tours of the Muhlenberg House. We will be open every weekend year-round. We'll have additional hours being added during peak tourism months. We also welcome group tours anytime, and we have lots and lots of fun activities for everybody to learn more. To follow us on social media, here's our handles, at Historic Trapp, at Lutheran Archives. So please take a look, and we hope you enjoyed learning more about Lutherans and the founding era. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Priscilla Eppinger, Executive Director of the American Baptist Historical Society, and I am pleased to be able to show you some Revolutionary Era documents from the ABHS archives. Or an alternative title, Cool Revolutionary Era Stuff. Because some of what I'm going to show you is just, it's sort of fun that we have it. I don't know that it's that historically significant. But I do want to offer my thanks first to Chris and to Spencer and to Michael and to Chris for all the work, and the history department and religion departments here at BYU for all the work that you have done to put together this conference together. All right. So I first want to show you something, a document related to Charles Thompson. Now, when I began thinking about Baptists in the American Revolution, one of the first names that comes to mind is Morgan Edwards, who was a very well-known Baptist pastor in Philadelphia. And as I researched a little bit, I discovered that he was a loyalist, not a patriot. So I'm not going to tell you about Morgan Edwards. Charles Thompson has kind of the quintessential American dream story, rags to riches. He was born in Ireland, emigrated at the age of 10 years old. He arrived in colonial America orphaned and penniless. And by 35 years later, he was a leader in the Revolutionary era in the early 1770s. He served as the Secretary of the Continental Congress for its entire 15 years of existence. And his role was not limited simply to taking meeting notes, but he took a direct role in the conduct of foreign affairs. And as some of us may be familiar with in our own meetings, the mere taking of notes is not always a simple thing. There is sometimes disagreement as to what was said or what was intended or how we interpret that. They sometimes came to blows on the floor of Congress. So the first show and tell artifact from our archives that I wanted to show you is an extract from the journals of the Continental Congress, which were written by Charles Thompson, and as you can perhaps see at the very bottom of that document, signed by John Hancock. Now, the content of this is not all that significant. It's talking about numbers of troops to be raised for Boston, and the original journals of the Continental Congress are in the National Archives. So this is an extract from those journals, but signed by John Hancock. So that's the cool part of it. You see that signature is very recognizable. The next document I want to show you is Charles Thompson's letter of resignation, because he had aspired to be confirmed as a secretary of the newly constituted U.S. Congress, or to be appointed Secretary of the Senate, but due in part to the dissent that there sometimes was in the Continental Congress over his job as secretary, he was not appointed to any official position. And so his letter of resignation sounds a little bit familiar to some politicians of today, who writes, in this case to President Washington, I'm resigning to spend more time with my family. More importantly, in terms of content, is the Reverend David Jones. He was a Baptist pastor, ordained in 1776 as the pastor of the Freehold Baptist Church in Freehold, New Jersey, which incidentally is the church that my father pastored when he was a seminary student at Princeton Theological School. So I thought that was a kind of interesting personal connection. He continued his pastorate at the Freehold Baptist Church until, in the words of William Cathcart, who wrote the Baptist Encyclopedia in 1883, continued his pastorate until his outspoken views in favor of the rights of Americans rendered him unpopular. So northern New Jersey had a lot of loyalists or Tories living there. And so he moved to Chester, Pennsylvania, where he became the pastor of the Great Valley Church. In 1775, the Continental Congress declared a day of fasting and prayer on July the 20th. David Jones preached a sermon called Defensive War in a Just Cause, Sinless. Jones's argument is actually in direct opposition to Mother Ann Lee's argument and the Shakers' position as to whether war was sinful or sinless. More resonant with the Congregationalist John Fletcher, who challenged his own pastor for discouraging the raising of an army, as we heard this morning. And in line with Presbyterian John Witherspoon's sermon, declaring war as just. Historian Robert Ferguson reminds us that as the primary literary vehicle of the times, the sermon forms a dialectic with the people's voice and prepares more Americans for rebellions than do books and pamphlets. The belief required for independence is literally born in these sermons. Now, his sermon, David Jones's sermon, was subsequently printed as a pamphlet, which you can see in the image. You can find transcriptions of this pamphlet online, should you wish to read it. There are copies in numerous historical libraries across the country. If you want your own copy, you can even order it from Walmart or Amazon. But if you want to see the actual sermon written in David Jones' hand, you must come to Atlanta to the American Baptist Historical Society. So I want to read some extracts from his sermon. Defensive war in a just cause, sinless. An endeavor shall be made to prove that in some cases, when a people are oppressed, insulted, and abused, and can have no other redress, it then becomes our duty as men, with our eyes to God, to fight for our liberties and properties. Or in other words, that a defensive war is sinless before God. Consequently, to engage therein is consistent with the purest religion. Here, some texts in the New Testament which prevent some good men from engaging in the present dispute shall be considered. With a heart depending on the Most High God, Abraham collects his servants and some confederates. With martial weapons in his hands, he pursues the foes and utterly discomfits the 4 kings and triumphantly brings back the captives with all the spoil. By Moses' hand, we receive the lively oracles of God, and the apostle bears him witness that he was faithful in all things. Does Moses think it his duty to make no defense? Let us view his conduct. Israel advances with sword in hand and utterly discomfits the Amorites. If we read the book of Joshua, his immediate successor, we shall find him of the same mind. Israel, first being enslaved by sin, were oppressed by various nations. But when they cried unto the Lord, he raised up deliverers, among whom were Othniel, Ehud, Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, and many others. This indeed is generally acknowledged when our dispute is with a foreign enemy, but at present it seems like a house divided against itself. Our dispute is with administration. This is cause of great sorrow. The following are thought to enjoin non-resistance in the strongest terms, namely, let every soul be subject to higher powers, for there is no power but God. The powers that be are ordained of God. But in order to rightly understand these words, it is of great importance to determine first what is meant by the higher powers. For this is what every soul is to be subject unto. We shall find no exposition liable to less exception than to understand by the higher powers the just, the good, the wholesome and constitutional laws of a land, merely respecting civil government. The very design of these higher powers is to secure the property and promote the happiness of the whole community. These higher powers, therefore, appear as binding on princes as on people. And as God has ordained these powers for the good of the whole, whosoever resists the same resists the ordinance of God and receives finally condemnation, and that justly. For anarchy and tyranny are essentially the same and equally to be dreaded, as each resists the higher powers. We cannot suppose either that this text enjoins absolute submission to all laws which may be made in a land, for some are so wicked, oppressive, and unjust in their nature and tendency that the best of men have thought it indispensable duty to obey them. The higher powers of which the Apostle Paul speaks are ordained of God. And if ordained of God, they must be like unto God, who is a God of unspotted justice and truth. We cannot suppose that the apostle meant obedience to all despotic ordinances of tyrants, for this would condemn the conduct of the Israelite midwives, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. The ordinances here can be none other than such are as good and ordained of God, for whose sake we are to submit to them, for which God has ordained for the safety of the people, to defend them against oppression and arbitrary power. To give a more particular answer to the objection that such martial engagements do not suit a meek and loving disciple of Jesus, consider that the design of laws is to punish evildoers, to bring to justice offenders, and to secure the innocent in the peaceable possession of their properties. For this end, God has ordained the higher powers, but in sometimes has been the case that those in whose hands these powers are entrusted become tyrannical and the greatest offenders. And shall they live with impunity? God forbid. How shall justice be obtained? There is only one consideration that is very discouraging, and that is the great and many sins that prevail in our land. Unfeignedly to confess and deplore our many sins is recommended by our Congress as one duty of this day. Thus, my hearers, I have considered every point which demanded our present attention. I hope that it has been made evident that a defensive war is sinless and consistent with purest religion. This I can say, these arguments have removed all difficulties from my own breast. Seeing, therefore, that it is sinless, and we are called to take the bloody weapons of death in hand, let not the expense of war discourage us. This indeed must be very great. But be it so. We fight not for present profit. No, our noble struggle is for liberty itself, without which even life would be miserable. Amen.
Good afternoon, and my name is Taffy Hall with the Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archives, and I also want to extend my gratitude to Dr. Fluhman and his amazing team here at BYU, and to Chris Stevenson for organizing this event and bringing us all together here this past couple of days. Following up on Priscilla's comments about when you want to learn about Baptists and the American Revolution. So as you journey down south to Atlanta, to her archive there to read these and other sermons and many other resources, you must also stop in Nashville, Tennessee at our convention archive for the Southern Baptist Convention. Just a little bit about us. We serve as through assignment of the SBC as the official collection agency for records and manuscripts. First and foremost, by and about Baptist, but we also work hard to fill in gaps of underdocumented Baptist groups and or just some different Baptist groups. And to that end, we're one of the largest collections anywhere of primitive Baptist materials, Russian and Eastern European Baptists, African American Baptists as well. Our collection takes up about 17,000 square feet in the SBC building in downtown Nashville. That includes about 12,000 linear feet of archival materials, 10,000 pamphlets, 20,000 reels of microfilm, about 150,000 annuals, 40,000 each photographs and biographical files, a large audiovisual collection, and a small artifact collection. And one component of that artifact collection, some artwork that we have, is what we're going to take a look at today here. There we go. I wanted to introduce you to this Erwin Hearn collection of paintings and drawings that we have. The majority of these, although not all of them, will cover topics of religious freedom, freedom of conscience, separation of church and state. It's primarily a collection of oil paintings and some pencil drawings. And then we'd include some background information as well. One series of this collection, the 8 Great Moments in Baptist Life, actually won an award from the Dallas Advertising Association for the best series of paintings. 5 of these 8 paintings will deal with Baptist and religious liberty. And then they will be also exhibited in the the Pavilion of Religion at the 1964 World's Fair in Washington, or in New York City. But the bulk of the paintings and drawings date from around 62 and 63. Some of them were commissioned a bit later. And then I also just wanted to note sort of some other subjects and what's not in them. Other subjects, Hearn drew about Baptist expansion throughout the country and prominent Baptist pastors, historians as well. But absent in the collection, there are only 2 art pieces in the materials that we have that have a female as the primary focus. There are other women in the background, but only 2 that focus on a female. And the voices of colonial American, Native American groups and African Americans are largely absent from the series as well. Our artist, Erwin M. Hearn Jr., was a Southern Baptist layman and member of First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas. He was, again, a professional artist. In addition to this work for our collection, in the 70s, Baylor University commissioned him to paint 12 oil paintings on Texas Baptist history, so those are down at Baylor. He'll paint scenes of the Great American West also. And then just another interesting side note, he does work on the 1974 family film Benji, about a beloved stray dog, if you're familiar with that. But his interest in Baptist and religious liberty. He lives from 1924 to 2006. And during the 1960 U.S. presidential election, so you'll recall that was Kennedy versus Nixon. And a major issue in that election was the fact that Kennedy was Catholic. And this causes a lot of discussion throughout the country, and it causes a lot of discussion among Southern Baptists. So Hearn, watching and listening to this election coverage, he becomes increasingly curious, why is this an issue? So he starts reading as many U.S. history books that he can about the history of the separation of church and state in America. And that leads him to the contributions of a couple of prominent early colonial American Baptists that we're gonna look at in these paintings. and to this realization of this really important role that early Baptists in America played in securing religious freedom in the country. And he just reads more and more, and then he reads Baptist histories. And then another Baptist Texan by the name of J.M. Dawson, who is very significant in Baptist life and a 20th century advocate for religious liberty. His writings on religious liberty influenced this artist. Dawson, side note, he is chosen by Baptists to represent Baptists at the opening of the United Nations in 1945, so Dawson's really important and has a big influence on this artist. But Hearn says, wow, here I am, 35 years old, and I'm just learning this history about these important stories of early Baptists. And he says, if I don't know this history that well, there's probably tons of other Baptists in the pews that don't know it that well either. And he says, I have this gift, I have this talent that I want to use because we don't have pictures of these early stories. And he says, I want to use this gift that I have to share what these Baptist contributions might have looked like. So he talks to his pastor, who was another prominent Southern Baptist there, First Baptist at the time, named W.A. Criswell. And Criswell and others say, you should go to Nashville and to the Southern Baptist Historical Commission, which was what our institution was called at the time. And you should tell them this idea that you have. And you all should come up with some way to illustrate this. So he does in the spring of 1962. And the director of our organization at the time, a man named Davis Woolley, he thinks about this for just about 2 seconds, and he says, this is a fantastic idea. And the timing is perfect as well, because in 1964, Southern Baptists, American Baptists, National Baptists, Canadian Baptists, they all coordinated. Actually, it was a several-year event we call the Baptist Jubilee event, the Baptist Jubilee Advance, culminating in 1964 for the 150th anniversary of our first Baptist organization in America in 1814, which we called the Triennial Convention. So Dr. Woolley says, this big event is coming up in 64, and we think more Baptists need to know about how significant early Baptists were in securing religious liberty. So anyway, the project becomes a collaboration between the Historical Commission and our convention's publishing board called the Sunday School Board. And then they go to town distributing these artwork pieces through tons and tons of Southern Baptist literature. So of course, this is just scratching the surface. But these would be things like Southern Baptist newspapers, magazines, Sunday school quarterly. So, you're in your Sunday school class learning the lesson, and this artwork is on the cover of your quarterly. The image on the bottom row, third there, Charity and Children, that's a publication for an orphanage, a children's home in North Carolina. So just a broad scope. And then one of the paintings that we're not going to talk about because he's out of our time period, but I just snuck him in this slide. In the upper left there, the man with the flag behind him, that's another prominent Southern Baptist named George Truett. And that's a very famous sermon, a very powerful sermon. He preaches on Baptist and religious liberty on the steps of the U.S. Capitol in 1920. But he's out of our time period, so we're not going to look at a little bit of his work here. But just real quickly, I wanted to highlight not, of course, all of these paintings and drawings, but just a few of them, and thinking about these two themes. And we'll look at the first theme there, freedom of conscience and separation of church and state, with the paintings, and then the real struggle this was for Baptists with the pencil drawings. So, and also I will say these paintings, the majority of them, hang in our library and archive in Nashville. This one of Roger Williams. And the other thing I wanted to be sure to mention as well, kind of as we're looking at these paintings and drawings, think your favorite current historical drama, in that Hearn was not only painting each painting, but on each subject he had read extensively. And he worked with a team of Baptist historians who supplied him with all kinds of details, time of day, who might have been present at the event, what their dress would likely have been like. But then some details, because we don't have actual pictures from the time, some details he took some artistic liberty with as well. And these descriptions were descriptions the Historical Commission staff wrote, again, working with Hearn on each of the paintings. So this, Roger Williams, this is the moment that he's leaving Salem, and Hearn, his inspiration and what he's trying to capture in this painting is Williams' final look back. And then he also takes the liberty, and you can sort of, I hope maybe you can see in the slide at the bottom, there's some doves there. But he paints those doves in to represent Williams' peace-loving qualities. And then this is Isaac Bacchus before the Continental Congress. And on this painting, Bacchus, a Congregationalist before he was a Baptist, prominent Baptist past evangelist, historian. And here he is before the Continental Congress. And Hearn's main point to convey in this is he's thinking about facial expressions. So he wants to capture Bacchus's intensity, his focus, his seriousness in his face. And he also positions Bacchus sort of right in the middle of that window there to draw your eye into Bacchus's face. And then John Adams, you can see him to the side of Bacchus. And again, I'm not quite sure how well this is showing up on the slides here, but in person in this painting, this is what is hanging right outside my office in Nashville. But Adam's face is red there, so just to sort of convey emotions in the painting. And then this image here was originally designed as a pencil drawing. This is Chaplain John Gano. It was not part of the original 8 Great Moments. It was commissioned about a decade later by our Southern Baptist Chaplains Commission. Gano, of course, traveling extensively in his chaplaincy work throughout the colonies and offering this prayer of thanksgiving. And then the final painting we'll look at briefly here is James Madison meeting with John Leland. And Hearn's inspiration in this painting is Leland standing firm like an oak tree. And I mentioned most of these were on display in our library. This one is actually on display in Washington, D.C. It is on loan to our Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And then the struggle for religious liberty is really evident in the pencil drawings. I mentioned only 2 of the pieces of artwork in what we have a female as the central character. And here is Isaac Bacchus's mother in jail for refusing to pay a clergy tax. And then here, the Baptists just wouldn't give up. They were singing on the way to jail. And one of the individuals pictured in depicted in this drawing, John Waller, here he is taking 20 lashes of a whip. Again, these drawings emphasizing the persecution that many Baptists faced for this freedom of religion. And then George Washington here, writing Baptists to tell them that no one would be more zealous than he in helping secure these religious freedoms. This actual letter that Washington is depicted writing here is available through the National Archives website. And so why does all of this matter? It matters because this story is worth remembering. Just like Erwin Hearn, our artist, realized in the 1960s that Baptists had huge contributions to the separation of church and state in America. It's worth remembering. Hearn was so excited at the time. He said he hoped these paintings would be teaching tools for future generations and to encourage Baptists to read 1,000 words and 1,000 more, putting a picture to these stories. But also this Baptist contribution that no one faith should be favored or superior to another. The fight that Baptists endured for that, these are all stories worth remembering. So just like our institution displayed these in 1964, and then they brought them out again at the 200th anniversary of our nation. Our institution's bringing them out again yet this year. We'll display these, or prints of these, at our convention's annual meeting in Atlanta this summer, or in Orlando this summer. And again, just another very unique, important way to study history through artwork. So thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Hi, y'all. I want to, of course, extend my thanks to everyone whose labor has made this conference possible. I'm Ann McShane. I am the digital asset librarian at Pitt's Theology Library at Emory University in beautiful Atlanta, Georgia. But today I'm speaking on behalf of the Friends Historical Association, a nonprofit dedicated to the study, preservation, and publication of material relating to the history of the Religious Society of Friends. During this presentation, I will use the term Quaker and capital F Friend interchangeably. Both mean members of the Religious Society of Friends. A friend is a Quaker, and vice versa. So before we begin, I want to cover a couple of things. The item I brought digitally today has some things that you need to know about Quakers before going forward, and I don't want to make any assumptions. First, though, Quaker practice is very diverse. And we have limited time. So just suffice it to say that anything I say here definitively, there are very interesting exceptions, and they are worth their own time to speak about. For the purposes of this presentation, though, Quaker life is centered around the meeting. This can take several forms, but is generally focused around a physical space, the local meeting house, and regular collective meetings of meetings, like a yearly meeting. And Quakers do not fight. Nonviolence is a deeply held and important belief for Friends. During the Revolutionary era, this extended to both refusal of military service as well as refusal of war taxes. We have some characters in this record that I'm going to bring to give us a little look at things. One is George Washington, who I'm not explaining in this time. The second is an unnamed group of Quakers going to meeting, who we've covered very briefly here. And the third is someone named John Lacey Jr. Who is that? John Lacey Jr. is one of the fighting Quakers who get a lot of ink spilled about them in this era. He is raised Quaker in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is just north of Philadelphia, quite rural. He joins the militia and is subsequently expelled from his meeting in 1776. But he's one of these exceptions that prove the rule. He's a fighting Quaker. By March of 1778, though, which is when our record is happening, he is the Brigadier General of the Pennsylvania Militia. He is stationed north of Philadelphia while the city is under British occupation. The item I've brought y'all is a letter from Washington of orders being sent to Lacey in March of 1778. It is from, physically, the Friends Historical Library at Swarthmore College. So I'm going to read it on my phone because I can't read things that far away. I didn't write it all down in my handwritten notes because that seemed a little excessive. So, headquarters, Valley Forge, 20th March, 1778. Sir, next Sunday being the time on which the Quakers hold one of their general meetings, a number of that society will probably be attempting to go on to Philadelphia. This is an intercourse that we should by all means endeavor to intercept, as the plans settled at these meetings are of the pernicious tendency. I would therefore have you dispose of your parties in such a manner as will most probably fall with these people, and, if they should, and any of them should be mounted upon horses fit for the draft or the service of light dragoons, I desire they may be taken from them and sent over to the Quartermaster General. Any such are not to be considered as the property of the parties who may seize them as in other cases. Communicate the above orders to any of the officers of the Continental Army who may command scouting parties upon your side of the Schuylkill River. I am, sir, your most humble servant. So, couple things, and really only a couple, because time limited. Okay, this is the one then. We have Washington ordering one of our fighting Quakers to stop Quakers on their way to meeting. But also these are Quakers who are very likely local to Lacey's own home. There is a lot of tension and mistrust. It is early 1778, and a lot of people are pretty miserable. Militiamen at the time were incentivized to essentially engage in highway robbery. When Washington says, as in other cases, that is because if they stopped people and seized their property, they were allowed to personally keep it. Not this time. But there is a lot of tension in the area, and it is continuing to heighten, and there's also quite a bit of suspicion. And you see one little moment of this here where, because the locals don't want to get stopped on the roads, they're kind of sneaking around more, which causes even more suspicion, even more tension. The war is weighing very heavily on all, and even the practice of faith is grounds for suspicion in this case. The second one, though, is kind of a fun one, which is, I don't know about y'all, but I hear about plans of the pernicious tendency, and I absolutely want to know what those plans are. So, obviously, perhaps if it's a truly pernicious plan, it would not make written meeting minutes, but it's always fun to check, and I was a little curious. I live in Atlanta, though, which isn't terribly close to where a lot of these records are physically located today. But if you have any interest in Quaker history, from the founding era, particularly from the Philadelphia era, they're very accessible records online. I was able to pull up minutes from the Philadelphia monthly meeting from late March of 1778, and they do seem to match the timeline. So we have perhaps some idea of what they were getting up to at this meeting, which is 4 pages of very standard things in the maintenance, the care and watering of a religious community, for anyone very familiar with church records. I bring this up not so much to show the great plans, but to note a couple of things and then be a real librarian for a second, which is to encourage you, if you have any interest, to take a look and see what you can find. Primary source materials, a lot of them are not online. In fact, the vast majority are not online and never have been in any form. But sometimes there are some, and it's really fun to look. In this case, well, there's a couple that wants to get married. That's great. And notably, right at the end of the minutes, there's some damage to our meeting house caused by the present occupiers. So again, we see this continuing series of tensions as people intersect. I would say really encourage you, if you have any interest, to just take a look and see what you can find. In fact, the most recent issue of Quaker History, to rep the brand a little, has a lovely article by Pat O'Donnell that goes through what kind of records Quakers were making in North America to 1827 and what they named those things so that you can find them in Quaker records. Miscellaneous is where the cool stuff is. So yeah, thank you very much. Hopefully I kept us to time. Yes.
Thank you all. We'll be coming back at 2 p.m., but also just as a matter of business, the National Museum of American Religion has a podcast, but also has a newsletter, which you can find on their website at mar.org/sign-up. Thanks, y'all. See you in 2 minutes.
is to be ruthless on timekeeping, and there will be no Quakerism from me on that score. I will be forceful. I'm Matt Mason. I'm a professor of history here at BYU. I want to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to sit right there so that if I need to, I can do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. I'm not going to sit there. I'm going to sit right there. First, we'll hear from Joel Brown. Joel Brown is president of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. And then we'll hear from Emily Nelms-Chastain. She's an assistant professor of Christian history and Methodist studies at the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. Finally, we'll hear from Gary Zola. He's the executive director emeritus of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives and a distinguished professor at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. And given the headlines today, I'm sure all of our thoughts go out to him and his entire community. But first, let's hear from Joel Brown. Please welcome Joel Brown.
Good afternoon. I also want to extend my thanks to Chris and our hosts for this wonderful conference that we've had the last 2 days. And I look forward to the rest of it, so thank you. I need to begin with a confession. I feel a little bit like an imposter at this conference. You see, disciples weren't around at the founding of the United States. The earliest we can responsibly trace our history back to is 1801, a full 25 years after 1776. So what could I possibly have to say, and what artifact could I possibly choose to make sense to share with you all? To the first question about having something to say, let me try this. The disciples of Christ, though not present at the founding, were born of it. The democratic ethos of the young nation was the soil in which disciples emerged, in both the movements centered around Barton Stone, whom I'm not going to talk about today, and the Campbells, Thomas and Alexander. Democratic political forms shaped their organization and activity, and the ideal of freedom occupied their religious imaginations. In many ways, disciples, I'm going to contend, were an early 19th century experiment in religious liberty of a particular American form. My emphasis here on freedom in the founding generation of disciples is not how disciples' history is typically told. Most know disciples as a movement that sought two things: Christian unity and restoration. That is, a return to the simple and plain teachings of the New Testament church as the mechanism for uniting all Christians. These two ideals stood at the heart of 19th century disciples' identity. But we might consider the movement's rootedness in American liberty as a kind of third pillar, and one which I think helps to illuminate its birth and formation within the democratic ethos of the young nation, as historian Nathan Hatch has described a couple of decades ago. It also gives me a reason to be here and to speak and to be with you all. As for the artifact, I'm sharing one of the founding documents for disciples, albeit not our earliest founding document. What I've brought is the Declaration and Address of the Christian Association of Washington, written and published in 1809 by the recently immigrated Thomas Campbell, the father of Alexander Campbell, whom you might be more familiar with. There are 6 extant copies of the original published Declaration of Address, and the original we are in the process of acquiring actually predates all 6 of those. It is the galley copy that the publisher in Washington, Pennsylvania, issued to Thomas Campbell, and on which he made edits that are reflected in the original publication, which in itself is pretty cool, right? But it gets even more interesting because a few decades later, Thomas's son Alexander was writing his father's biography and made some of his own marginal notes on the manuscript. So the version includes the pre-published edits of the founding father and later the notes of the founding son. And you can see here the title page and the first page of the declaration of the galley copy. Our archivists at the Disciples of Christ Historical Society don't trust me to travel with any originals. So what I have here is the 1908 facsimile pictured here on the screen, which I am actually going to try to pass around if it's possible. Somebody just keep track of it so I can get it back. This copy was made in advance of the celebration of the centennial of the publication, so for 1909. This particular facsimile, which is printing number 10 in a limited series of the centennial version, is part of my personal library, although we have another in the collection, which again, our archivists won't let me, don't trust me to travel with that one either. So, but why this artifact, the Declaration and Address? Why is it significant historically? The major argument of Thomas Campbell in the Declaration and Address is his conviction that the grand design of the Christian religion is to reconcile people to God and to one another. Hence the central focus on Christian unity, which was central and personal for Thomas, having immigrated from Ireland, where he'd witnessed religion division and violence. Upon arriving in the U.S., the presbytery in southwestern Pennsylvania called Thomas and sent him out to preach, where he ministered to many people on the frontier who did not have churches of their own denomination nearby. Campbell's ecumenical spirit and his ministry led to trouble with other ministers within the presbytery. After several months of contention and hearings, Thomas withdrew his connection to the Associate Reformed Synod. Yet he still found many opportunities to preach, and he quickly attracted a following of like-minded folks who embraced his emphasis on Christian unity, and who eventually together formed the Christian Association of Washington, modeled on the Evangelical Society of Ulster, which Thomas had associated with in Northern Ireland. The association was not intended to be a separate denomination or even church, but rather a multi-denominational group of individuals concerned about the divisions within Protestant Christianity and committed to promoting Christian unity. With the association formed, Thomas set out to write its statement of purpose, which took the form of a manifesto for Christian unity and freedom. The Declaration and Address of the Christian Association of Washington, in this sense, should be read, I think, as mirroring the Declaration of Independence, at least the Declaration section of it. What I want to suggest and underscore is the thematic resonances between the Declaration and Address and the Declaration of Independence here, particularly the analogical relation between political or civil freedom and religious freedom, while being careful not to equate the two. Thomas, and later his son Alexander, declared freedom from religious tyranny and freedom for religious self-determination for the people of God. The Declaration and Address, we should have this quote. There's Thomas Campbell, joyful-looking fellow. But he declares in the Declaration and Address, awake, awake. Put on thy strength, O Zion. Put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. Shake thyself from the dust, O Jerusalem. Arise, loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion. Resume that precious, that dear-bought liberty wherewith Christ has made his people free, a liberty from subjection to any authority but his own in matters of religion. Call no man father, no man master upon earth, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. Stand fast, therefore, in the precious liberty, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. For the vindication of this precious liberty have we declared ourselves hearty and willing advocates. Although Campbell's emphasis on the authority of Christ in this particular excerpt may not sound like the language of liberation you might associate with the founding era, and I'm so grateful for Dr. Kidd's lecture last night, which helped me better understand religion within the imagination of the founders. But this appeal to Christ's authority is different. And yet his primarily Scotch-Irish immigrant followers would have heard awakened echoes of heroic tales about their Scottish ancestors. To them, setting Christ on his throne meant repudiation of all earthly rule, ecclesiastical or civil. And this was a mandate for freedom in both the realms of politics and religion. Divine sovereignty and Christian liberty were two sides of the same coin. Eventually, disciples would adopt a 17th century slogan to capture Campbell's position here. In essentials, unity; in opinions, liberty; and in all things, charity. For disciples in the decades following America's founding, their situation in the young nation offered what felt like a heaven-sent opportunity to start anew, in religion, in government, and in the pursuit of happiness. In the Declaration and Address, Thomas speaks about this in glowing terms as a thorough reformation of all things civil and religious, in the following passage, where he draws a direct line connecting freedom of the church with freedom in the state. And I should note or warn you that perceptive listeners will catch Thomas's anti-Catholicism that pops up throughout this manifesto. The favorable opportunity which divine providence has put into your hands in this happy country for the accomplishment of so great a good is a consideration of no small encouragement. A country happily exempted from the baneful influence of a civil establishment of any peculiar form of Christianity, from under the direct influence of the anti-Christian hierarchy, and at the same time from any formal connection with the devoted nations that have given their strength and power unto the beast, in which, of course, no adequate reformation can be accomplished until the word of God is fulfilled and the vials of his wrath poured out upon them. Can the Lord expect or require anything less from a people in such unhampered circumstances, from a people so liberally furnished with all means and mercies, than a thorough reformation in all things civil and religious, according to his work? Thomas Campbell's Declaration and Address reads as a kind of manifesto declaring that in America, Christians are freed from ecclesiastical control and freed for reunification or reconciliation with God and with other Christians. This reconciliation would require a recovery or a return to what Campbell termed the simple evangelical Christianity of the early church, also referred to as primitive Christianity. For Campbell and for early disciples, religious liberty and restorationism were necessarily bound one to another. As I get toward the end here, let me say a little bit about the place of restorationism in the Declaration and Address and for early disciples in relation to the founding of America, which I think will help illuminate why I would characterize the early disciples as an experiment in liberty. Walt Whitman's poem, O Pioneers, captures well the feeling of many in the decades following the founding. All the past we leave behind, we embark upon a new, mightier world. Alongside this sense of a new world taking shape in America was a corresponding desire for recovery, a return to something ancient and pure. They were looking for what religion scholar Mircea Eliade called sacred time, the time of the gods, as opposed to the profane time of human history. This was true within the political realm. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention didn't necessarily look to recent political history for guidance, but to the classical world in seeking to connect to something universal. It is instructive that they were trying to form a government that honored the rights of man rather than, say, the rights of Englishmen. And in the realm of religion, the same impulse to recover the sacred past shaped several movements, including existing groups like Baptists, new groups like the Shakers. But the two groups most taken by projects of restoration were disciples and Mormons. Now, I won't dive into what it meant for Mormons right now, but for disciples, the primitive impulse was directed at the early church because of its proximity to the incarnation, the inbreaking of sacred time. They perceived the simple teachings and practices of the early church as undefiled by human-imposed traditions and creeds. If Christians would return to the model of the primitive church, embracing their liberation from the creeds and clerics of the old world, then Christians would be reconciled one to another. Simple as that. Thomas, as well as his son Alexander, was inspired by the American experiment. They saw in its founding and its democracy just the sort of government God intended, one in which Christian union could be realized. In my opinion, the religious formation, reformation they were leading, and the new venture of the United States were, at least in this historian's opinion, parallel and compatible experiments in liberty. And in conclusion, I need to qualify everything that I've just said if I'm going to be responsible as a historian. I've spoken descriptively about the Declaration of Address and positively about the role of liberty in the early history of disciples. But that freedom that they talked about had limits. Some disciples could not imagine that same freedom, political or religious, extending to enslaved African Americans, for example. The disciples' experiment in religious liberty does not float above that history. It is entangled with race, racism, and settler colonialism. And I also feel the need to state here at the close that their treatment and optimism about the American experiment, especially as developed in the later thought of Alexander, planted the seeds for a kind of proto-Christian nationalism that leaves me feeling uncomfortable. And I'm pretty sure Thomas and Alexander and Barton Stone would have been uncomfortable with as well. But here's what I hope you'll take away. We would do well to remember that those who responded to the plea of the Declaration and Address were daughters and sons of the Revolution. They believed both experiments in liberty were consistent, that both represented the purposes of God, and they gave their hearts both to the nation and the restored church with little sense of strain between the two, for better and for worse. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to again say thank you to all of the sponsors for this day and for last night. It has been a really wonderful opportunity. You put a bunch of church historians and archivists together and we have a party. It's not the party everybody expects, but you know. I also want to say thank you to Dr. Ashley Bogan, in whose place I stand today, because she could not be here. She is our General Secretary of the General Commission on Archives and History for the United Methodist Church. So internally, as Methodists, we often teach our students that Methodism grew up with the United States and that it has often had a lot more similarities than differences. And so I'm going to try to point out some of those. I can't pull out all of Wesley's writings, If you've read some of them, you know they are voluminous, but I wanted to bring 3 artifacts to show to you to kind of talk about this turning point. These artifacts show how Methodists helped found American religious life for themselves by practicing liberty as conscience plus organization, not just as a slogan. So this first artifact is John Wesley's pamphlet, Thoughts on Liberty, which he published in 1772. It's a very short, very punchy piece, as John Wesley often wrote, written in this moment of political agitation. And Wesley is doing something here that is very Methodist. He refuses to let liberty remain this vague cheer. He insists that it needs a definition because definitions shape our behavior. So there's one line that I've highlighted here that captures this center of gravity. Wesley defines religious liberty as a liberty to choose our own religion, to worship God according to our own conscience, according to the best light we have. Now, in the pamphlet, Wesley is sharply critical of what we might call performative liberty, when people shout freedom while forcing neighbors to comply or going off and having no rule of law at all. In other words, Wesley is trying to form a public that can tell the difference between liberty and intimidation, or as he calls licentiousness. Wesley isn't writing this in a vacuum. He's responding to a moment when liberty has become this chant, that it's so powerful that it can excuse behavior that's basically coercion. In the pamphlet, he gets a very concrete picture. Wesley describes liberty as being enforced by intimidation, that neighbors are pressuring others to perform political loyalty, and if they refused, then they were met with threats. He calls this the working of a patriot mob because coercion was not liberty, but licentiousness. Wesley's arguing that liberty is not simply the loudest voice in the street. Liberty has to be tethered to a moral center. It's what you can do with integrity before God. So when Wesley defines religious liberty as worship according to our conscience, he's actually doing a lot more than theology. He's offering a founding era warning. A free society can still reproduce coercion, but with different enforcers. So this artifact gives us a theory or an orthodoxy of liberty. Liberty isn't do whatever one wants. It's freedom guided by conscience. It's accountable before God. Which then raises another question. How does this idea become durable during this movement? Wesley's answer was not just to preach or to give a social or political critique. He offered structure. That's what our Methodists are really good at. He built a system where liberty is practiced as a disciplined community. So Artifact 2, published in the same year, 1772, The Nature, Design, and General Rules of the United Societies. This little booklet is basically a portable constitution for Methodism. It defines membership as a desire to flee from the wrath to come. It establishes local offices like class leaders and stewards. It sets a rule of life, and it even outlines enforcement, who belongs, how they are formed, and what happens if the rules are persistently broken. This pamphlet describes what a Methodist society is, what it's for, and how it holds together across distances. John and Charles Wesley co-authored this pamphlet. They define the United Society as, quote, a company of men having the form and seeking the power of godliness, united in order to pray together, to receive the word of exhortation, and to watch over one another in love, that they may help one another work out their salvations. That is a remarkable decision because it frames religious community as mutual accountability, as a disciplined association that forms character over time. And the Wesleys are explicit that this kind of watching over one another in love requires a system that you can reproduce. So they divide societies further into classes, small groups of leaders that meet regularly, they check in on spiritual life, they gather money for the relief of the poor. These societies are doing pastoral care, discipline, social support, and it's engineered to scale. So Wesley gives them, in these general rules, 3 simple headings for a way of life. Number 1, do no harm. So basically Wesley says, avoid any evil of any kind. Number 2, do good. In this, you are to practice mercy. You are to love as far as possible to all people. Number 3, attend upon the ordinances of God. Every chance you get, you should attend worship. You should read scripture. You should be praying. You should take the Lord's Supper. You should be fasting. Now, John and Charles don't treat these as inspirational ideals. This pamphlet includes enforcement. So if someone habitually breaks these rules, they're admonished. And if they refuse to change, quote, he hath no more place among us, unquote. This is not a state church. This is a voluntary association with teeth, ordered liberty, maintained through accountable belonging. This is where the founding era of Methodism really becomes, or the founding era contribution becomes clear. Wesley gives this definition of liberty in a previous pamphlet, conscience and ordered freedom, and then these rules showing what liberty looks like as a practiced life. So it's this freedom shaped by habits, by community, and by accountability. So if thoughts upon liberty is the moral argument, the general rules are the practice, the social technology. Together, they form a people. And once you have a people, you need leadership and coordination, and this is where the next year, 1773, comes in. So we shift from texts to persons and places. Wesley had already entrusted one Thomas Rankin with governance work years earlier in the English Methodist movement. He sends a letter to request, quote, Tommy, to, quote, fix the quarterly meetings as he pleased. These quarterly meetings are governance. They are where the connection gets coordinated, itinerancy gets mapped, disputes get handled, and where discipline is maintained. This is a Methodist connectional order in practice, which is why Rankin is just the kind of person that Wesley sends to organize Methodists and superintend their work in the colonies. So in 1773, Rankin presided at the first American Methodist Conference. And this matters because a Methodist conference is not just a meeting. It's a method, Methodists. It's a method for making a movement durable. It's shared discipline, it's shared appointments, it's shared standards, and it's a way to carry decisions across geography. Now, during that conference, they reported 8 stationed preachers serving approximately 1,160 members of societies across New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia. Methodism grows outward from this initial mid-Atlantic center, and those numbers can create a coordination problem as much as a success story without order. Thus, conferencing for Methodists functions as governance and this mechanism for growth, for sustaining doctrinal unity, for sustaining disciplinary standards, and for holding mutual support across these widening circuits. And to show what conferencing actually did, I want to borrow Francis Asbury's own description of an early conference, which you can see printed here. Thankfully, someone printed them because his original handwritten notes and journals were lost in a fire at the publishing house. He describes the conference making concrete agreements. They established a doctrine and discipline, society boundaries, print control, and reporting. And then he diagnoses that there's a significant need for accountability. Quote, money had been wasted, improper leaders appointed, and many of our rules broken, unquote. That's ordered liberty essentially in practice, these voluntary associations holding together or held together by accountability. But pay attention to what Asbury is actually describing. These early conferences are acting like a constitution writing body for a voluntary religious movement. They agree to enforce doctrine and discipline, meaning a preacher who won't live by the rules can be removed. They agree not to administer the sacraments at that time, not because sacraments don't matter, but because they're trying to keep boundaries clear in a volatile moment and avoid acting outside of their authorized order. They set standards for membership. Attending society more than once makes you a member, so Methodist names a formed practice, not a one-time enthusiasm. They regulate print by only purchasing and reprinting through the connection, because they understand that ideas spread through these texts, and texts can either unify or fragment a movement. And they require reporting from the circuits to the general assistants, which is an early Methodist accountability. They show evidence of their work, not just the emotion. So Asbury's diagnosis is not petty. It names why discipline matters. The movement was learning a founding era lesson. Liberty without order collapses. In the political sphere, constitutions exist to keep freedom from turning into chaos or domination. And in Methodist life, conferencing and discipline served a parallel function. They made a religious public durable across distance, conflict, and rapid growth. As you can see, the movement's durability has a physical footprint in the map on the left side of the screen. Between 1764 and 1780, there are 5 early meeting houses that anchor the work of Methodism and act as significant places of memory for the founding of Methodism in America. The Strawbridge Log Meeting House outside of Baltimore, Maryland, was established in 1764. John Street Meeting House in New York City was organized in 1766. St. George's Church, established in 1769 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and still a working congregation. Barrett's Chapel, established in 1780 in Frederica, Delaware. And Mabry's Chapel, also established in 1780, west of Norfolk, Virginia. Now, these buildings matter because they signal a shift from a movement that is just meeting in private homes to becoming more legible in public space. A chapel becomes a commitment. It is anchoring worship. It's stabilizing leadership patterns. It's making the society visible to neighbors. It's the material sign of a durable religious public. Faith that is organized enough to persist and reproduce, but local enough to root in ordinary places. And what makes these buildings historically interesting is that they embody a founding era logic. Voluntary associations need structures to endure. A chapel isn't just a place to worship. It signals property held, funds raised, schedules kept, leaders appointed, and members gathered in repeatable rhythms. And in political life, constitutions translate ideas into durable practice. Now, it would be easy to tell this story as a steady rise, but the revolution actually complicates Methodists, and this kind of strengthens that argument. During the Revolutionary War, many of the Methodist itinerant preachers actually withdrew from the colonies. They were actually kind of forced. They didn't necessarily voluntarily go. They were being tarred and feathered because they were being treated as suspicious because they were English. So only Francis Asbury remains in the colonies, and he holds all of the work of Methodism together. And then in 1784, John Wesley sends Thomas Coke to officially organize American Methodism with Asbury. Together, they became the movement's general superintendents, stabilizing the work by authorizing ordination and establishing governance so American Methodists could continue as a durable church and not just a set of societies dependent on English personnel. So that 1784 moment matters for the founding theme of Methodism. It shows how Methodists are adapting to political rupture with institutional creativity, and they're rebuilding authority structures so that they could persist on American terms. So if the founding era is remembered for constitutions that translated ideals into durable public life, early Methodism offers a parallel story in religious form. Methodists practiced liberty as conscience shaped in a community through voluntary association, shared rules, and conferencing that held far-flung societies together. In that sense, Methodism helped build this durable religious public, not by mirroring the state, but by showing how ordered freedom can be sustained when people covenant to watch over one another in love. Methodists didn't just preach liberty, they organized liberty into a way of life. And that is one reason its imprint on American religion during the founding era proved so enduring. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let me also join the chorus of all those who are expressing their gratitude to our hosts. Thank you so very much. And I told Chris, you know, it takes me 5 minutes just to take a breath, so I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'll try my very best. As you heard, I just want to mention, since we're dealing with archives, that for 26 years I was the executive director, now emeritus, of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives, located on the campus of Hebrew Union College. We believe it's the largest catalog collection of documentary evidence on the history of Jewish life in America. So I begin. Before I'm bringing to you really what is the most famous, well-known document related to the Revolution and the beginning of the Republic, and that's the letter that George Washington wrote to the Jews of Newport. But permit me, if I can, to just set the context so you have a sense of why this letter is not only important to the Jewish community, but I think arguably is truly a great American document. I was thrilled, by the way, when I got here last night. We had a welcome dinner for the panelists, and the vice president of Brigham Young spoke to us on work that he's doing in research, and there he is. He's talking about not only the letter to the Jews of Newport, but also some of the other letters. I'll get into that. But I wasn't upset at all, because I'm going to go in a little different venue. So let me begin by pointing out that the Jews look to America as an exception. And this exception is not the kind of exceptionalism that we talk about when we speak about American exceptionalism. Jewish exceptionalism means, and I'm doing this as quickly as I can, that in all of diaspora, in all of the history of Jews wandering outside their ancient homeland, there has never been a more commodious place for the Jew than the United States of America. That's what we mean when we talk about American exceptionalism. The Jews come to this country by accident, in community. In 1654, let me go back one if I can. They are 23 men, women, and children were down in Curacao. They were, they were in Pernambuco. They were in Brazil in a Dutch colony, and they're going back after the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Brazilians retake Pernambuco. They get on a boat. They want to go back to Amsterdam, and they end up, can't get into why and how, but they end up in New Amsterdam. And when they arrive in New Amsterdam, they're immediately told, we're going to put you on the next boat back to Amsterdam. But they want to stay. They're impoverished. And they get permission to stay from the Dutch West Indies Company. Now, that means that, and this is important, there is no other example in all of diaspora history where the Jewish community is in place preceding the beginning of the Republic. And that's very important. Now, by the time of the Revolution, there are 5 functioning Jewish congregations, though we're talking about a very small population, maybe 0.1% of the people in the colonies. And as you can see, they're located in 5 places: Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. And if you want to know why not Boston, which is so old, it's because Jews needed to be in port cities so that they could do their merchandising, and they also needed to be in a place where they had the greatest latitude for religious freedom, where they were not going to be molested. Now, in this period, Jews were permitted to, there was never a time in all of colonial history where Jews were forced to live in a ghetto. There was, we'll have to see what happens in our own day and age, but we've never had any kind of pogroms against Jews in this country. And so to sum it up as quickly as I can in this setting, in the colonial period, Jews had many, many wonderful rights. They could do business, they could live where they want, they could interact with people. There were also many disabilities. Very often they had to pay church taxes, even though it wasn't for them. They also couldn't hold office or any honorific office and so forth. So they were with one leg in a world that they loved, that was very open to them, and in another leg there were still disabilities. Now, when the Constitution is written, there's a sixth congregation that comes into existence, and that's in Richmond, Virginia. There you have it. Now, after the victory at Yorktown, and then eventually the Treaty of Paris that's signed in 1783, you know that immediately, pretty much, we have movement towards the establishment of a constitution that will give the federal government ability to handle matters of economic issues, interstate disputes, national defense, and so forth. But I want to mention the Articles of Confederation, which nobody has really talked about, but were put into place as the war breaks out. And the Articles of Confederation are so very important because they're all secular. There's not even the year of our Lord is mentioned in the Articles of Confederation. So as this new constitution is being shaped, the Jewish community is concerned. They would like to know, what is exactly going to happen, the Articles of Confederation. And so the community meets, and the convention begins. And I'd like to just point out that which I think was already said, and that is that at this constitutional convention, there were some of the patriots who were ready to envision a nation that didn't have one religious tradition. I would say that, as far as my studies have taught me, all of the patriots were interested in freedom of conscience, or at one sort or another, but not everyone believed that a nation could exist without the people all ascribing themselves to one religious tradition. So you have people like Jefferson and Madison, as we've heard, who did, but then you had people like Patrick Henry and others who felt they didn't want to molest other people, but they did feel that there had to be a unifying religious tradition. So this is why this man, Jonas Phillips, who was at the time the president of the Philadelphia Jewish Congregation, he writes to George Washington in the middle of the convention. He writes a very famous letter, and in essence he says, he asks Washington, and you can find this letter on the internet, it's at the National Archives, a very famous letter. He says, I'm asking the convention, on behalf of myself, on behalf of my children, on behalf of the 13 colonies filled that have where Jews may one day live, give us equal footing under the law. He didn't know when he wrote this letter that they had already debated this and they had voted on it, and the decision to separate, if you will, or to give religious freedom of conscience in place was already decided. But this gives you an indication of the concern that the Jewish community had, and that's what brings me, in a sense, to the Constitution itself. The Constitution, of course, is passed by the convention, but then it has to go out to the states for ratification. And the first state, if you've ever seen the license plate, you know, is Delaware. That is the first to sign up onto the Constitution. And then, of course, you have to have at least 9 of the 13 colonies have to agree to the states. And you see that by the time of June 1788, you have 9, New Hampshire, and that means the Constitution is going to go into effect, and Washington is going to become, in early 1789, the president, and he sets about as soon as he is installed as president. He's inaugurated in April of 1789. He begins making tours, goodwill tours, to different parts of the new nation so that he can unify the nation. And, of course, as the new president, this man who's sort of a demigod, he receives letters of congratulations from so many different groups, including so many of the different religious traditions that are here with us today. And just to give you an idea, he gets letters from a letter from the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Churches. He gets a letter from the Roman Catholics. He gets a letter from the United Baptist Church. He gets a letter from the annual meeting of the Quakers. He gets a letter from the directors of the Society of the United Brethren for the propagating of the gospel among the heathens. He gets a letter from the chiefs and counselors of the Seneca Nation, and even the Virginia, the Virgin's Fair and the Matron's Grave of Trenton, New Jersey, and many, many more. Now I'm going to give you, there were probably between 1,500 and 2,000 Jews in the United States at that time. I'm going to give you a guess at how many letters this community sends to Washington. And if you guess 1,500 or 2,000, that's a good guess, because that's typically what we would do, because nobody speaks for us except us. But actually, embarrassingly, 4 different letters. And I'm just going to concentrate today on what I consider to be the most important, and now we finally will get to the Jews of Newport. Now, you all know that Rhode Island was the very last state to join the Union and to become part of the Republic. And after that happens, Rhode Island, there's many reasons for that, but I can't stop now. So when that happens, which happens, they join in early 1790, Washington makes plans to go up and to do one of his tours up to Rhode Island, up to Newport. And when he arrives, he is welcomed by various representatives of the community, and the president of the Jewish congregation reads a letter to him. And this is what I want to focus on, because the other letters that were sent to Washington, we do not have the exact wording of the letter or of the presentation that was made to Washington. Only the Newport letter do we have the actual text. And I want to quickly go into that now. The text was delivered by what we would call today the president of that congregation. I don't know, maybe there were 30 people in this congregation. His name was Moses Satius, and Satius was a prominent businessman in Newport, and he writes this letter, which he reads to the president when he's in Newport, and then he hands the letter to him. So very quickly, you see this is the letter from the Library of Congress. That Satius, you see his name signed at the bottom. And I just very quickly, I'm going to read to you the most important thing. I can't go over all the letter, but you see how they begin. Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection. They don't start with the words, let the Jews of Newport, let the Israelites of Newport, let the Hebrews of Newport. They do this deliberately. And if you think that Moses Satius sat down and just simply wrote this letter out and then read it to the president, I'm sure you're wrong, because this probably was worked on for weeks and weeks in advance of the arrival to make sure they communicate. Why the children of Abraham? To emphasize that we're all connected religiously. Because remember, friends, that the Jews were really the only outsiders. Because all these other groups, even the Quakers and so forth, were all part of the Christian milieu, even if you were a dissenter. Now, I must read to you the next paragraph, which is the most important paragraph, which many people are not familiar with what it says. The next paragraph that I want to read to you in this letter is, deprived as we heretofore have been for the invaluable rights of free citizens. And we really don't know what they're referring to here. Is he referring to America? Is he referring to the history of the Jew? I don't know. With a deep sense of gratitude to the almighty disposer of events, we behold a government erected by the majesty of the people. Now hear this. A government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience, immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal part in the great governmental machine. So ample and extensive a federal union whose basis is philanthropy, mutual confidence, and public virtue, we cannot but acknowledge to be the work of the great God who ruleth over the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, doing whatsoever seemeth him good. What I'm saying here is this is a question put in a sense of a question in a statement. In other words, we are living, President Washington, in a country that gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. What's not there is correct. Am I right? So when you see, and this is what Dr. Collins spoke about yesterday, this is the copybook. There were two letters that Washington wrote to the Jews in response, thanking them. One which is in private hands, and then the copybook which is in the Library of Congress, but it's signed by Washington, which is very rare. And as you see, Washington now writing back, and this is what Dr. Collins emphasized, he literally restates and actually strengthens rhetorically Moses Satius, or the Jews' line. Washington gets credit for it, but the Jewish community put it in his mouth. This is a government which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And then, as Dr. Collins said, and with this I will end, Dr. Collins, who spoke to us, made this very important point. Washington gives them then, in this paragraph, in the first line, what they didn't even dream of. All they wanted to know is that this is going to be a nation which gives them the freedom to pursue their religious tradition. That's all they wanted. And if you see, he says in this letter, Washington, he says, all possess the liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of. And this is what Dr. Collins spoke about last night, meaning it's not because we who are in the majority are giving this to you, because we're tolerating you, we're making room for you. You're part of the citizenry. You're one of the people. And this is a God-given, he won't use that word, we heard about that from Dr. Kidd, but he's not going to say God-given, he says it's if you will, it's a native natural right. Well, we feel that this is something so very important to America, perhaps in light of what you were talking about. I'm not sure everybody knows that once again we had a bombing in a very beautiful synagogue at which I've spoken today It's happening as we're meeting, so I don't know all the details, but it seems like, at least before I spoke, it didn't seem like anybody was injured. But at any rate, this letter reminds us our first president, the only president to be actually appointed unanimously. This is what he believed, so that should be implanted in the hearts of every American. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Yeah, if you've been good citizens of this conference and haven't been checking your phones, it really is a dire situation. And about 30 miles away, very similar MO to an attack on a Latter-day Saint chapel a few months ago at a Jewish synagogue. Last I saw, only a security guard was injured, no congregants killed. On a much lighter note, although we don't have any time for Q or A, I just want to highlight that these were fantastic presentations, and Emily's reminded me of one of my favorite things about the 18th century. You can't tell them how to spell. They're going to spell choose however they feel like. And to some degree, you all avoided that by sticking relatively close to time, so thank you all. Reconvene in like 3 minutes and 45 seconds, something like that. 4 minutes and 58 seconds.
Everyone, this is the final session of this conference. I'm going to applaud you for still being here. This is incredible. You deserve just some kind of special, I don't know. We've saved such great presentations for you. This is going to be a great session to finish off this really memorable conference. So welcome to this final session. In this session, we consider how religious groups remember and make meaning of the founding. So this is there were some kind of precursors of that in this last session, but we're going to take that on today. How the founding echoes toward our present. We're honored to have specialists from varied backgrounds to help us consider these questions. Again, full academic bios on the website, and here are their kind of short introductions. We'll hear first from Dr. Spencer McBride, Senior Managing Historian at the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then we'll hear from Sandra Bigtree, record-breaking conference participant. I mean, the overtime you've put in, Sandy, on this is incredible. You have filled in well for your husband. You've done Philip proud, and we're so grateful for triple duty here. Just wonderful. We'll hear from Sandra Bigtree again. After her, we'll hear from Munir Sheikh, Vice President of Operations and Academic Affairs at Bayan Islamic Graduate School in Southern California. Then our concluding presenter will be Dr. Lerone Martin, the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in Religious Studies, African and African American Studies, and the Nina C. Crocker Faculty Scholar at Stanford University. And we'll go from there. Thanks. Spencer.
All right, good afternoon. To understand the Latter-day Saints and the 250th anniversary of the United States, we have to start with a little history. But of course, the historian is going to say that. In 1776, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was not yet founded. However, from the earliest days in the history of the church, in the 1830s, its leaders and members have revered the founding of the country. And this comes in an interesting moment. In the wake of the violent expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from Jackson County, Missouri in 1833, church leaders are discussing how they can seek redress for their violated rights and for their confiscated properties. And it's in this setting that Joseph Smith, the church's prophet and president, dictates a revelation that is written in the voice of God. And this revelation is later canonized in Latter-day Saint scripture. And a verse of it reads as such: "And for this purpose have I," meaning God, "established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood." So the very first Latter-day Saints saw the founding of the United States as a divinely orchestrated event significant to God's plan for the redemption of humankind. And this wasn't in and of itself a unique position at this time. This was a time of providential rhetoric, providential explanations, not just in the United States, but in Great Britain and in a host of other Western countries. People like to know that their country is favored by God and that their country has a special role to play. Americans and the Latter-day Saints, not unique in this sense at all. However, their rhetoric had less to do with the United States and much more to do with what the United States was a means to. The country was not the great ends. The founding of the country was a means to a greater end. And so they celebrated the founding of the United States even as they look forward to the second coming of Jesus Christ and a millennial era where there would be no nations, where there would be no national distinctions. And this matters because the Latter-day Saints saw themselves as being cast in a starring role in the last chapter of God's plan for the redemption of humankind. As Christians, the Latter-day Saints are neither Protestant nor Catholic. More commonly, they are categorized as Restorationist Christians, believing that the gospel of Jesus Christ was restored in its fullness through a series of visions and revelations to prophets such as Joseph Smith. So as the early Latter-day Saints saw it, the founding of the United States allowed for greater religious freedom. And that greater religious freedom paved the way for the restoration of the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So to early Latter-day Saints, the founding of the United States again mattered, but it was not the end in and of itself. It was the means to a grander end. And so what did they mean exactly by a divinely inspired and orchestrated founding? Well, early Latter-day Saints, even as they celebrated the country, lamented that too often it was not living up to its grand ideals. This verse of Latter-day Saint scripture comes even as they were violently expelled from their property in a country that celebrated liberty and justice for all. Clearly, it did not mean all. And so the Latter-day Saints could celebrate the founding and be critical of their country when it fell short at the same time. These two things were not mutually exclusive. And they could also look at the founding as divinely inspired, but also see shortcomings in the founding documents and in the founders. Those two things did not negate each other. I'll give you an example, one of many. Joseph Smith in 1844 ran for president of the United States. Spoiler alert, he didn't win. But in his pamphlet supporting his campaign, he opens the pamphlet celebrating the greatness promised by the United States and lamenting that, quote, some 2 to 3 million people are held in bondage because the skin that covers their soul is a different color than ours. In this pamphlet that he celebrates America and the founding, he also is just very honest and forthcoming about its shortcomings. Divinely inspired to Joseph Smith did not mean perfect. Divinely inspired founding documents did not mean infallible. He could celebrate and lament all at the same time. Now, this is important history, not just because I'm a history nerd who loves this stuff, but we've seen various trajectories of how the founding is talked about over the course of Latter-day Saint history. It is consistently revered and celebrated by American Latter-day Saints. But what the meaning of divinely orchestrated and inspired is, that has been contested even in subtle ways. And once you get into the 20th century, especially post-World War II, you get a more prominent interpretation that is much less nuanced than Joseph Smith's and much more celebratory and divinely inspired. Sometimes means that the Declaration of Independence and Constitution should be read in the same way that Scripture is read. And I'm not saying that all Latter-day Saints subscribe to this interpretation, but it becomes far more common in the 20th century, even as Joseph Smith had given a different example. And so what of the Latter-day Saints today and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the United States? Well, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a global faith. It has American origins in its founding, but it now has far more members living outside the United States than in the United States. Still, the story of American independence is part of the church's story, part of the story of restoration. And so in the United States, Latter-day Saints, have already started, and we can expect more, to celebrate the founding of their country, and to do it in many of the same ways that their non-Latter-day Saint neighbors do, but also with this lens toward what the Revolution and American independence set in motion. Institutionally, I think there are a number of ways that we'll see the church and its members recognize the 250th anniversary. One is going to be through acts of service. Now, this is a long-standing tradition in Latter-day Saint culture, but even more recently, I think starting in 2021, on September 11th of every year, church congregations join in a concerted day of service as we remember those who lost their lives on the attacks of September 11th, 2001. The way that they commemorate that day is to serve their communities. And the church itself has announced that as part of America 250, they are donating 250 semi-truck trailers full of food that will be delivered to food banks in 50 states. There will be in church magazines articles on the religious freedom and the founding of the United States. I know this because I wrote one of them on the Declaration of Independence, and they haven't pulled it yet, so as far as I know, it's going to be there. But there will also be other ways that the church commemorates this. On May 31st, they've asked congregations in the United States to meet in the hour time that's normally spent for Sunday school or meetings such as that, having discussions as congregations about America's founding and religious freedom in particular, and how we can treasure and build greater universal religious freedom. On July 5th, the First Presidency, the governing body of the church, has asked church members to join in a day of fasting and prayer to give thanks for the religious freedom brought forth eventually by the revolution, and to pray that it will be strengthened and made better and more universal. And I anticipate we'll have a host of other speeches and statements all centered around this celebration. But again, with the theme being the United States was not the end, it was a means, or is a means, to a greater end that is much more universal, as it's put in Latter-day Saint history and scripture. But in closing, I think it's also important to note that Latter-day Saints themselves are not immune to the polarization of our time. Even as we see the 250th anniversary of the United States be a time of celebration, but also a time of contestation. Which parts of the founding do we celebrate? Which ones do we downplay? Can we talk about it in all the good and all the bad that came from it? And in this sense, the Latter-day Saints are not exceptional. American Latter-day Saints are, after all, Americans, and they are battling with this the same way that everyone else is. And so it will be interesting to see how this perspective of the revolution and the founding, bringing about greater religious freedom, which Latter-day Saints believe brought about the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ, with the end of the salvation of humankind in mind, how that factors into the celebrations, but also the contestations over the 250th anniversary. If I could tell you exactly how that would play out, I wouldn't be a historian. I'd be in a profession that profits off of prognostication. But it is something that as a scholar and as a Latter-day Saint, I will be watching with great interest. Because to Latter-day Saints in the United States, America's 250th anniversary is not merely a historic commemoration or a patriotic celebration. In many ways, it can also be seen as a spiritual moment. Thank you.
Here we go again. Okay. Been talking about the Haudenosaunee, and I'm going to give you some more background now on who the Haudenosaunee are. As I said, Philip Arnold, who's professor of religion at SU, was the founding director of the Scano Center, and these slides are going to be taken from the exhibits. And you're all welcome to come visit anytime you're in central New York. More than welcome. We started the center with Scano because that's always the first greeting when a Haudenosaunee encounters another person. And the greeting is Niawen Scano, and it means I am thankful that you are well. But a deeper context of this translation entails that you can only be well and you can only experience peace when you're in proper relationship with the natural world. And that is the core of our identity, is that special relationship. The next, the next station is on the Thanksgiving address. This is a recitation that occurs every single time the Confederacy convenes or council convenes or people gather. They give this address, and it's an acknowledgement to the natural world, and it's addressed to the people, Mother Earth, water, fish, plants, food, medicine, herbs, winds, thunderers, sun, God, Mother Moon, the stars, the Enlightenment teachers, our spirit protectors, Creator, everything. And it's used as a way to build consensus, because we do not vote. This tradition of peacemaking never voted. It was this process of peacemaking and consensus building, and it's recited every day, and it's part of ceremonies. And as I'd said earlier, we do not pray. All the ceremonies are based around gratitude to the natural world. We move on to the creation story. It's quite different, our founding story. Sky Woman was pregnant with child, and she uprooted the celestial tree out of curiosity, basically fell through into the void of space. And as she's plummeting towards Earth, there are creatures and sea creatures who see her falling, and they hold counsel right away to determine how can we prepare a place for her to live. And so the birds fly up to cradle her and gently place her on the back of Turtle, who graciously said, yes, she can establish her home on my back. So they're seeing she has seeds in her hand that she brought from the sky world. And so all these little animals are like, oh, we can't dive deep enough to collect any mud, but Muskrat said, I think I can do it. So he dove as deep as he could, and he came up there, and with his last breath, he slapped a piece of mud on the back of Turtle. And her very first gesture was to begin a dance of gratitude, moving counterclockwise on this little pat of mud. And in doing so, the mud began to grow until all of Turtle's back was covered with mud. And that's why you often hear that you're now living on Turtle Island. This is the creation story behind that. Humanity would never have existed here had not the natural beings come together to provide a home. We do not perceive ourselves as stewards of this earth. It's more likely that the natural world are stewards of us. They provide us with our medicines and everything. So anyway, everyone lived very peacefully for thousands of years, until which time they got lazy in the responsibilities that it requires to show respect to one another and to be honest and attentive and taking care. You know, it takes a lot. And slowly those values would erode. And so slowly but surely, people began to bicker with one another over something insignificant. It grew, became into outright battles. It broke up families. It extended beyond the families and moved into nations. And there was a time, a few thousand years ago, there was downright warfare all across our territory. And our leader was called Tadadao, and he was a cannibal and murderous and a sorcerer. And it just seemed people were so off the track and full of grief that it was beyond repair. And then we had a young man who was Wyandotte. He was across Ontario Lake on the other side of the waters, and he had a vision. And the Creator came to him and said, I can give you instruction to carry across the waters to the Haudenosaunee and bring them back to peace. So that's why this story is so important. So the peacemaker did arrive into the territory, and the very first person he encountered was Jigonzase. It was a woman, because he saw her big heart and that she was feeding the warriors on both sides, just hoping they would come together, speak, and work things out, right? The peacemaker said it is not going to work that way. It's not going to come through dialogue, because you have the inability of understanding, your relationship here. And so he gave her instructions. She had to go into the forest. She selected 49 women. He told her to have them follow the protocols, and in time, one individual animal would present themselves to her, and that would be her new clan identity. She didn't go looking for the animal. The animal had to come to her only if she behaved and followed the protocol of respect, with the natural world. So those 49 women would thereby be title holders. They became the clan mothers. And those titles still exist today. And they're still carried at the Onondaga Nation. And those women select the clan male counterpart to her, and they both are referred to as Loyani, which means they're people of the good thinking. That's a poor English translation because we don't see the world in good and evil. But in any case, that laid the groundwork. The next person the peacemaker encountered was Hiawatha, and you've all heard of him, I think, through, I can't even think of his name, it's mentioned, Longfellow. And that has no resemblance to our Hiawatha whatsoever. But Hiawatha was in great despair. He was overcome with grief. 5 of his daughters were killed during warfare. He had once been a wonderful orator, and he so wanted peace to reside among his people, but he'd lost his voice. He couldn't hear anything, and he was totally ruined. So the peacemaker approached him and picked up wampum shells from the waters and used the shells to condole Hiawatha and restore his mind, clear his ears and his throat so he could once again speak. And together, they all joined the peacemaker, and they said, we have to now unite all the 5 nations in accepting this peace, which is rooted around your relationship with the natural world. And so they did so. Everybody bound together, and it was going to be the only way they could turn the head of the most evil person living, and that was Tadadao. And they were successful in this. And Tadadao's hair straightened, he had snakes coming out of his head, and he accepted the peace. So the so the peacemaker said, you will represent the central figure of the Haudenosaunee. You will relinquish your clan because you will remain neutral, and you will hold that title. And that title is still acknowledged at Onondaga. And our Tadadao meets with presidents, maybe up till this administration, I think not. But they have existed for thousands of years, living under these tenets of peace. It's a very old tradition. So that they did. And I want to show you, this was created let me see. So when they all came together, they planted a tree of peace, and that would be a white pine, because there's 5 needles clustered on every branch, right? That would represent the confederacy of 5 nations. And there would be the eagle perched on the top. There'd be 4 roots that would spread to the 4 directions of the earth to whomever would listen and want to learn these tenets of peace. And this wampum belt, Onondaga have these replicas, but they let me borrow them for this talk, which I'm honored to have traveled with them. But this represents the Confederacy. The tree of peace planted in the middle is the core. The eagle, is on top that we know, and the roots will spread. It protects all the clan systems of this family. This is the Mohawk Nation over there, the eastern door. This is the Oneida, this is Cayuga, and then Seneca. And there's 2 lines on each end that are there that you are welcome to join them at any point. Their arms are open. So like I said, they had, I forgot the number. It was over 100 nations, I think, that joined them under the wing of the Great Law, and that's the immensity of their influence by the time Europeans came here. First contact was with the Dutch, and that was 1613, and the Haudenosaunee made a wampum belt to show they will not interfere in their path. The language is that the colonists will sail in their ship down their river of life, and the Haudenosaunee will go down their canoe on the river of life. They will sail down the river of life in parallel lines without interference, and they would respect each other. They would be friendship, reside in friendship, and respect, and they would experience peace. So that's what this belt represents. Very first contact with the outside, they were welcoming. They didn't tell them to go away. There was no fighting. They were welcoming and generous. They were, diversity was not an issue, but yet you can remain sovereign and separate, but don't interfere with one another. But the thing that was missing is down the river of life, because Europeans came, they wanted to commodify our land. That's where it fell off track. Money got involved, greed, all of it. So we're living together pretty well for several years. And then, the British come, the Sullivan-Clinton campaign was ordered by George Washington, and it burnt out our entire territory, as I had explained earlier with Joseph Brant, that trickery. It was just absolutely horrific. Washington paid his troops with Indian land. They came back and they didn't have a homeland. They didn't have any trees or anything. Everything was destroyed. And so they called George Washington, by the way, a Haudenosaunee. Every president since that time they address as Haudenosaunee, and that translates to village destroyer. So they have a very different relationship with this colonial contact. After the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, when Washington allowed them to come back into the territory, he realized, oh, they have such influence, maybe I should make amends. So he solicited his Oneida allies to help him design his own wampum belt, which he presented to the Haudenosaunee. Now, this was a stretch, but he wanted them to believe him. And the reason wampum is used with a quahog shell is because of Hiawatha's healing from grief. Grief is very central to peace. And whenever one of our Loyani are raised, they go through a ceremony of condolence, because many people are sad. Either the prior Loyani passed, and the family needs to be condoled. And so it's a very rigorous part. So I guess George Washington understood that, so he wanted the belt to be out of wampum. So here it is. It's the widest one. It's pretty huge. Here, you can hold that in, and we'll just try to stretch it out. It has 13. Where's my phone? Okay, 13 bodies, which represent the 13 colonies. There, at the center, is a longhouse. He wants to make peace with the Haudenosaunee. You notice everybody is holding hands, so we're trying to display friendship. In the center are two smaller figures on either side of the longhouse, and those two figures are George Washington and our Tadadao. And there's a parade every year in Canandaigua, and this wampum belt, the original, is brought out, and that lesson is, repeated to everybody. Onondaga still receives I don't know how many bolts of cloth that were part of this treaty, but they received them every single year from Washington, D.C. Very interesting. So 4 years later, the Haudenosaunee are not doing well because they've lost all their land. They're not doing well. And a prophet appeared to them in 1799. It was a Seneca man. He had a vision, and he was instructed to say, if you're going to save this long tradition of peacemaking. This is what you have to do. I've been instructed to communicate this to you. One was to stay away from the Black Book, the Bible. The second one, stay away from alcohol, and then stay away from gambling. So Onondaga has no casino. They're one of the poorest nations in the country, but strongest and richest, in my opinion. And they don't collect any money from the United States outside of this treaty. And they're quite remarkable. This is the people. Because of Handsome Lake, the Haudenosaunee retain their pre-colonial clan system of representational government that is the core and fire of the peacemaking that they have practiced for thousands of years. And this is who the women's rights suffragists met. And they were talking to the women. They were so inspired, by their freedom. They've been taught it's the natural state for women to be subservient to men. After all, she's been made from the rib of a man. And so when women from Europe came over here and they saw how strong Haudenosaunee women were, and they could choose leadership, and they set ceremonies, they named the children, they were comfortable, they wore comfortable clothing, and here these poor women are in corsets and tight boots. Anyway, they needed to rebel. And this is, in Seneca territory where the Mormon church was founded, right? So this stuff is all going on. Then you got the Erie Canal. I won't even go into that. But anyway, one of the suffragists, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, was written out of that historical account of the Haudenosaunee influencing the women's rights movement. She was the most prolific of them all, and she wrote the bulk of the history of women's suffrage. And she wrote about the Haudenosaunee influence. And the famous book she wrote at that time was called Women, Church, and State. And the problem was she criticized the church because she'd been talking to the Onondaga. She was written out of the history, although her name is still on that book. She's been, resurrected, I guess, over the last several decades. Even Ken Burns mentioned her in the women's suffrage film he did. So, we're moving forward. I mean, there's still a lot that can be learned from Indigenous people. What has been learned has been truly profound, and I just wanted to share all that with you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I greet you with Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon you. I want to thank the organizers. It's a privilege to be here in this important event to understand how different faith traditions have a place within the narrative and how we can develop that narrative even further. So I'm going to be speaking about Islam in early America. I'm not going to read a paper, but I'm going to present some slides to kind of give more of a broader perspective of the place of Muslims and Islam in these early centuries of the American experience. I can see if I can advance this slide here. Let's see. Okay, so just as a point, oftentimes, in our public memory of Islam, probably we think about, since 9/11, 2001, or perhaps going back a few decades to the Immigration Act, 1965, and immigration since then, which has resulted in, the Muslim population today in America, which is perhaps 1% to 2% of the U.S. population. There are different estimates of the total number, something like, I would say, 4 to 6 million Muslims in the United States today. But we can appreciate the fact that Muslims have been present in these lands since the earliest period of European or Afro-Eurasian presence in the New World. One of the earliest figures who's attested in documentation amongst the Spanish conquistadors is a figure named Estevanico de Azamor. He was apparently a Moroccan or Moorish person from Morocco who had gotten enslaved by the Portuguese and the Spanish, and he became part of an expedition of the Spaniards out of Cuba into Florida, and then the expedition, of course, faced hostilities with the native people and dwindled in size, and Estevanico was one of 4 people ultimately made their way across the southern United States into the Southwest and New Mexico. He died in New Mexico after many years of exploration in search for Cibola, along with his fellow explorers. So Estevanico is considered probably the earliest Muslim to set foot in these lands. But the larger majority of Muslims came from West Africa as amongst the enslaved population. I'd just like to read a quote from an academic scholar. The contributions of African Muslims in colonial American life are often lost in discussions of the formation of the United States. Though their names and stories can be pieced together through archival records, the early history of African Muslims in the American South has long been under-acknowledged by scholars and in the American memory at large. So Muslims today in the United States, contemporary Muslims, are looking for ways to inscribe their story into our collective understanding of American history. A big part of that is an acknowledgement and an uplifting of the presence of Muslims who were enslaved in West Africa and brought to the southern United States and continued to practice their faith, sometimes in secret, sometimes with great difficulty. They weren't necessarily forcibly converted to Christianity. Initially, there was opposition to that kind of activity because it felt that it might equalize, right, the standards of these people and make it more challenging, I think, for Christians to maintain segregation. So there wasn't necessarily that internal or external push to convert to Christianity, but circumstances did not really make it convenient or congenial for Muslims to practice their faith. Their dietary habits, of course, not consuming pork, the prayer times that they try to adhere to, and the language, the Arabic language that they try to preserve. And there is evidence that some scholars who were enslaved did make attempts to preserve their language and religion and pass it down. It's interesting to note that Thomas Jefferson, whom we heard a lot about last night in a wonderful keynote, collected a variety of scriptures from different religious traditions, including an English translation of the Quran. We don't know to what extent he consulted the text of the Quran in terms of some of the ideas that are present there, I would say, and I'll share a little bit about that in a few minutes, that I think align with notions of freedom and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion that Enlightenment thinkers themselves had articulated within the Western tradition. Muslims often like to point out the fact that the first nation outside of France that recognized the United States as an independent nation from England was the Kingdom of Morocco. And a treaty was established and a delegation from Morocco was sent to Philadelphia, I believe, to engage with some of the founding fathers. A treaty was established thereafter, and Morocco, even today, Moroccans, if you go visit Morocco, they will say with great pride that they were the ones who acknowledged the United States. But nonetheless, there was conflict between the fledgling United States government and various parties in the Mediterranean in North Africa. The Barbary Wars were undertaken in 1801 to 1816, so conflicts in terms of ransoming American sailors or merchants who had been enslaved by North African Muslims, and the American government was paying tribute in order to release those captives, and at some point they decided that it was not worth it to keep paying those ransoms, and they built a navy, right? So this was an impetus for the United States to create the Navy and the Marines, and so that's an episode that is also worth keeping in mind in terms of our construction of a narrative about the relationships between the United States and the Muslim world at large. Coming back to the experience of the African Muslims who had been enslaved, along with Africans of other backgrounds, not just Muslims, but we do have evidence of certain individuals, such as the ones that are displayed. I'm sorry, I haven't been advancing the slides. So this is Thomas Jefferson's Quran, and then Morocco acknowledging the United States, and we talked about the Barbary Wars, and here we are. Okay, apologies for that. So Omar ibn Said was a very famous Senegalese scholar who was enslaved in North Carolina. Bilali Muhammad was another such figure. These are some of the texts that are available that have been preserved from their writings in Arabic. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo and Ibrahima Abdul Rahman were enslaved. They lived in the United States for a period of time, several decades, and then they were manumitted and able to return back to West Africa, to their homes. I'll read just another quick excerpt from a text that I consulted. There was a figure named Charles Ball who escaped slavery after spending some time in bondage in South Carolina. And he mentions Muslims in his own memoir, a slave memoir that was published in 1837. He was not a Muslim himself. Ball writes, "I knew several who must have been, from what I have since learned, Mohammedans, as Muslims were known. Though at that time I had never heard of the religion of Muhammad. One of the people Ball may have later realized was a practicing Muslim was his own grandfather. Ball witnessed his grandfather's unfamiliar habits without knowing of the existence of Islam, but describes them in a way that aligns closely with Islamic practice and belief, perhaps the bowing and the recitation in Arabic." It's also worth noting that in the Revolutionary War, archival records suggest that about 300 individuals that can be traced in terms of their names were Muslim. So that's probably like 1 in 10,000 members, either on the 1 in 10,000 members in the Revolutionary War, and actually even in the Civil War. There were Muslims fighting on both sides of the conflict. So small number of people, but there is evidence that they were present. Okay. Just going a little bit beyond the 1700s, we get into the mid-19th century, and that's when we start to see a greater influx of immigrants from Syria and Lebanon, who are Middle Eastern but white passing, and they assimilate into American society at large, in the North particularly. But Islam starts to be known as a religious tradition. One of the famous converts, maybe one who could be considered a founding father of Islam in the United States, is Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, who became the spokesperson for Islam at the World's Parliament in 1893, when the World's Fair took place, and various religious traditions were represented in that event. So we often hark back to Alexander Russell Webb. Another interesting figure in that time period in the 1850s is an immigrant from the Ottoman lands who was an expert in raising camels, and the United States government hired him to go out and try to develop a camel corps in the American Southwest as a means of traversing the desert landscape. And he's buried in Arizona. Hi, Jolly. And then I want to talk just for a few minutes about notions of pluralism that may be found in the Quran and the Islamic tradition. So there is a passage in the Quran, one of the verses is very explicit. Of course, this is pertaining to the time of Muhammad the Prophet himself in the 7th century, dealing with pagan Arabs and their desire for him to create a syncretic religion where Muhammad would acknowledge their gods and they would be willing to acknowledge Allah or God. And revelation came down to Muhammad in this language that he should recite to them, "For you is your religion and for me is my religion." So there was a clear sense that it wasn't going to be a scenario where they could create a mixture of religions, but that they would have to maintain these sort of boundaries and sort of emphasis on monotheism that Islam is founded upon. So there is a sense of theological integrity in this particular passage, and it actually facilitates a sense of pluralism because it involves the coexistence of different religious systems. And then another passage, let there be no compulsion in religion. Muslims often cite this as an important foundational principle in their own engagement with people of other religious traditions, that it's simply impossible to force someone to embrace a belief system that they don't actually believe in. They might outwardly, under compulsion, state something, but internally, obviously, they still maintain their conviction. So the Quran is acknowledging that this is actually a truism, that there cannot be any sort of compulsion in religion. So I think that this accords well with some of the concepts that Enlightenment thinkers themselves were developing and producing in their writings. And then lastly, this particular passage. So the Quran is instructing the Muslims, the followers of Muhammad, that they shouldn't get into a lot of disputations with people of other religious traditions, but they should encourage one another to compete in good works, to acknowledge that there's belief in one God, that there's belief in the prophets, that there's belief in scriptures, that there's belief in a day of judgment and accountability. And rather than getting bogged down in disputation, focus on doing good works and competing with each other in that regard. So these are important passages within the Quran that I believe provide a foundation for thinking about how Muslims can, in the United States particularly, and in the West in general, can integrate their political theology, their political thought about freedom of conscience and freedom of religion within the larger conversation. Thank you very much.
Friends, we've made it. It's good to be with you, and it falls upon me to be the last one to address you on the panel and try to keep all of you awake and keep all of you from looking at your watches about how far past 4 o'clock have we gone. I want to take a departure, I think, from some of what we've heard today and talk to you about a movie. You know, when I thought about the theme of this panel, which is about memory, I thought about how memory can feel at once complete and exhaustive and covering everything, but also can be incomplete at times and stunted. So I thought of a movie that I watched for the first time when I was a graduate student at Emory University doing my PhD. It's a movie that came out in 2009. It's a movie called 500 Days of Summer. It's a whimsical film, pretty fanciful in many ways. And it's a typical story. Boy meets girl. Girl and boy date. They break up. Boy is upset, and boy moves on. I was working through some things as a grad student. But this movie I wanted to talk about today because it's notable not because it's an original story, but the way that the film talks about memory. In this film, Tom Hansen is the main character, and he literally lives off of narrative. He is a writer for a greeting card company, and he writes narratives and stories for his job. He lives and moves and has his being by writing narratives. And he is also one who believes in fate. And so he meets a coworker. Her name is Summer. And the film chronicles 500 days of their relationship. And they start off with this amazingly awkward but beautiful relationship. And throughout the film, you see this relationship grow, and it flips back and forth between time. Sometimes you see the 400th day of their relationship, then it goes back to the 15th day, and so forth and so on. And eventually they break up. And as a viewer, you're not quite sure why, because the film has been shown through Tom's memory about how beautiful and perfect their relationship was. And as he's going through the breakup, he's completely distraught. He's moping, he's sad, he loses his job, and he can't understand why Summer would break up with him. And he even starts to demonize her in his memory about how could she do this to him. He even starts doodling really mean photos of her, the way that a 20-something-year-old would do. And finally, it's up to his little sister in the film, who says to him, I know you think she's the one, and I know you think that somehow she's broken your heart and that she's an evil, horrible person, but when you go back and think through your relationship, look again. Go back and look again. Because all you're thinking about are the good times, but I think if you go back and look again, you'll see where your memory has failed you. Friends, I think in many ways today, at times, America is Tom. I think that we often live off of narrative. We tell the story of the founding, but oftentimes, especially today, in dealing with what we're dealing with from the current administration, there is an effort to only imagine the good times. Our memory is being constructed, a narrative is being told that to really understand America is only to highlight the good stuff. And we miss the fact that in the relationship, the things always haven't been great. That at times our memory fails us. And I think part of what many religious communities do, what you've heard today, especially what the African American religious tradition does at its best, is to remind America that things haven't always been great, that we always haven't lived up to our narrative that we live off of, this idea that all men and women are created equal, and are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, which among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so in the film, you get a chance to finally see when Tom goes back, it shows all the moments and the cracks and the crevices of their relationship. And you see that it wasn't that great. So I want to challenge each and every one of us, a call to action. Those of us who are historians, preachers, clergy, teachers, writers, everyday folk, that as we approach this 250th anniversary, that as we go into this season of celebration, make sure when you go back, you look again. Look again at all the stories of when, not just when America's been great, not when the love affair with democracy has seemed perfect, but actually when it seems fractured and broken. Look for those voices. Lift up those voices who often aren't heard. As we heard earlier, history is often told by the victors. When you go back, look again. Look for those who are considered the losers, for those who have seemed to be left to the side. Look, go back and look again. At the end of this film, it's almost 4 o'clock, I'm doing good. At the end of this film, we don't know if Tom has learned his lesson. He's lost his job. He's getting ready to start a new position. And he goes to interview for a new job. And at the new job, as he's interviewing, he meets another girl. So he's presumably healed from dealing with Summer. And now he meets another girl whose name happens to be Autumn. And Tom, who's played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, looks at the camera and smiles, and the film ends. And so it is with us. We're about to go into a new season. We're about to mark 250 years. As we go into another 100 years, another 200 years, will we learn the lessons from the previous season? Will we learn to listen to those other voices? Will we learn the lessons so we don't keep repeating the same mistakes? I don't know what happens at the end of the film. There was no part 2. There was nothing in the credits. I stayed and waited in the movie theater thinking there was going to be something like a Marvel film where there's going to be another scene. But then I'm comforted by that because it means that, like Tom, we have an opportunity to go back and look again and try to learn the lessons from the past. Thank you.
What a great way to end this panel. Thanks to our panelists. In lieu of a question and answer period, I'm going to invite Chris Stevenson to come forward and give brief concluding remarks on the conference to kind of help us begin to think through all that we've learned, all that we've experienced, begin to put this in a kind of new frame for all of us as citizens, as fellow travelers here. Chris, come on forward.
Okay, I will be quick. The National Museum of American Religion is indebted to the religious scholars, religious archivists, religious librarians for sharing their expertise and knowledge, while all of us try to get our minds around this very broad topic of religion in the American founding. I think it's much broader for me than it was at the beginning of yesterday. The museum thanks all who have helped in putting the conference together here on this campus, which includes the BYU History Department, Political Science Department, the Wheatley Center, and America 250 Utah. It has been a Herculean task, and we're so grateful for that. And last of all, I want to thank all who have watched any of the conference sessions, either in person or via live stream, and for the many who will watch all or part of the proceedings in the future. It is for you, the museum's audience, whom we call the National Mall tourist, that all of this was organized. So the mission of the National Museum of American Religion is to tell the story, which is actually made up of many, many almost limitless stories of how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion. This includes the establishment of religious freedom in the U.S. Constitution's Article 6 and Bill of Rights religion clauses. These last 2 days, we have explored just one thread, an important one, a multi-stranded thread to be sure, but just one thread in this large fabric. Please become a friend to the museum and sign up for our newsletter by going to our website and going to Get Involved drop-down and going to the newsletter sign-up. I guess the last thing I'll say, really to what Spencer asked me to do, and it's not going to be very long because I think for me and hopefully for you, I think this is the invitation we got from Lerone, is we need to sort of sit with all this and think pretty deeply about religion and the American founding. Even the terms we use in that, religion, we learned, isn't really the paradigm or it's not in the vocabulary of the indigenous peoples. So that sort of twists everything a little bit, but it's still an important topic, religion or the life ways and the American founding. So as we all go our separate ways, I guess this is the museum's invitation. It is our hope, and I think our partners' hope, that, and this is the reason we did the conference, that each of us, after thinking, and I wrote a bit here, I think thinking a lot about what we have heard these past 2 days, will now improve in some meaningful way what we do regarding religion's role in perpetuating the fragile American experiment in self-government. That it, including and embracing everyone who lives within its borders, that this government, that this American experiment in self-government fulfills its purposes, that we contemplate what those purposes are through the filter of religion or life ways, and that we try our best to do during this semi-quincentennial year where we commemorate or celebrate or acknowledge the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and all that let loose, that we think deeply about that, and we do whatever we can to push that along in ways that are meaningful and helpful and not in any way detrimental, because certainly none of us would like to use religion, our connection to deity, to be used in ways that harm others. So thank you very much for attending, and that's all I have to say, Spencer.
That's it. Thank you.